It will take nothing short of 100 proof living to restore lives. Join a conversation between a cop and a criminal with Brian Yates and Chris Pridmore, working to inspire and motivate others, rebuilding the communication breakdown. This is the 100 Proof Living Podcast.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chris Pridmore, and today I'm going to be flying solo. Brian had some previous commitments, but we mutually agreed that our guest today, her story was too important to delay. And today we have in the studio, she's a New York State Certified Recovery Peer Advocate. She's a peer leader in Connections Rounded Recovery, which is a brand new facility in Canandaigua, New York. She's a mother that knows all the challenges and rewards of being a mother. She's a survivor of some pretty serious struggle. She's a person in recovery, and my personal friend, Caitlin Meath. So thank you for coming to the show today.
Thank you.
Today, the reason that we talked about timing and why that was so important to have you in here is just, I feel like from what I've learned, we've been friends for about 2.5 years now. I mean, our journey's fairly similar in terms of sobriety. But, some of the recent challenges that you and I have talked about and some of the things that you faced, I feel like our audience really needs to hear how you face those, but particularly, kind of couch that and what your story is. And if you wouldn't mind sharing something about, some about your history and how, how you got to this point, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. When I first was considering that really simple question, the first thing that came to mind was that, well, I'm an addict and I'm an alcoholic. And then I was mindful of that and reversed my thinking. And I do identify as a person in recovery and someone who has battled with substances and gone through struggle, as you put it, and as someone that struggles with the disease of alcoholism. However, I'm so many more things today, and for that I'm truly, truly grateful. I wouldn't have been able to say that in the past. Like you said, I am a mother, I'm a daughter, an employee, hopefully a confidant, a friend, and this sharing here is very important to me in the matter of communication.
Right.
And the value of using our voice and maybe being a voice for someone who doesn't have that opportunity right now.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that you're willing to do that, because some of the things that you share, I know it's kind of a recent strength that you've found to even be able to disclose a lot of what really goes on for you. How do you feel, as some of the things that you're going through? I don't know if you want to get into some of the history that you have, but, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to recognize that you are a lot of other things. What we know you to be today, a lot of us that met you only a few years ago didn't know what you hold in your head from the past. We only know the value and the impact that you're having in people's lives today. And I'm just, kind of curious about what led you to this point.
Sure. So, like I said, I struggled for a number of years with heroin, crack cocaine, and alcohol. Alcohol was always my baseline and my go-to. Mm-hmm. A little over 2 years ago, I had that full surrender. I don't know if you want to call it divine intervention or what you would call it, but it was a turning point for me. And it's been a daily process, a daily learning experience, and reprieve. One of the biggest things that I really needed to understand, and like I said, it's all been a process, is that this isn't a moral failing, that there's not something morally wrong with me as a human being. I'm not a bad person. I was someone who was very sick and using dangerous substances and ways of coping. So today I have found a different way to live, a different solution. For me, that looks like Alcoholics Anonymous, yoga, outside help such as therapy. And as you mentioned, I am a certified recovery peer advocate at Connections Rounded Recovery in Canandaigua, New York, which is a really huge milestone, I would say, for the recovery movement in general.
I would say that program is pretty innovative in the fact that it is peer-led. The thing I appreciate about what you're doing down there, though, is it is such an open-door policy. Somebody doesn't have to be in treatment, so to speak, to go in there. They can just have an understanding of what's going on, have a safe place to land, and sometimes treatment ultimately comes out of those conversations.
Absolutely. So the center is peer-led and peer-driven, which, as you say, is completely innovative. And I think that it's going to be necessary for surrounding counties to follow suit. And I think that's the way it's looking. For someone who has the lived experience of having been there, done that, and all of the components that lead into the substance use that takes part during the substance use and the aftermath, to have someone with that experience who can say, hey, I've been here, I can't imagine what you're going through right now, but I've been there too. Those are such empowering, profound words. And like you mentioned as well, there's no referral necessary. All the activities that we do there are free and open to the community at large.
Yeah. And I think that, and herein lies, I think, some of the challenges that you and I equally share in that is that in those environments, we're trying to show people a better way, but yet we're still in recovery.
Sure. So that simultaneous healing in a way, right? Yeah. And I can say from experience that there are things that have sort of made me relook at some traumas maybe from my past. And I think that brings in the self-care component, right, and really maintaining my own recovery. And I've learned the separation of it, right? So I've learned that when I'm at work, and sure, I spread a message of hope and try to act as a role model in my position, but understanding too that outside of work, I need to maintain my recovery program and what that looks like for me as an individual. And a big part of that is my daughter and mending the relationship that I have had with her over the last few years. That was when I would say recovery-wise, some major growth took part in my recovery because it was not only addressing some deep, deep wounds from my past, but it was some real hard, traumatic stuff that I addressed.
Yeah. You shared some of the stuff that you've gotten in, some of the things that you've been challenged with. Yeah. And I don't mean to speak for you on this, but one of the things I admire about how you approach your recovery and how you approach helping other people is that you, I feel like you're honest with yourself and you're honest with others about yourself. So if you're in a place where you don't feel like that information is going to help the situation you're in, it's going to put too much burden on, you're pretty good about regulating what you share. At the same time, though, one of the examples that you've been to me personally in my recovery is to make sure that I'm being stable and honest with myself, not making a situation that is traumatic become too much of a driving factor in my daily behavior. It may be something still weighing on me, but it can't change how I'm behaving today. And some of the conversations we've had and things that you've shared, it is impressive to me how you do that. Now, we are in a world right now where there's a lot of new peers, a lot of people coming into recovery, and they're trying to be in this peer role where they're helping others. How have you found a balance there where, you do have days where your recovery is harder? I know I'm the same way. There's days when you're kind of tired out.
Sure. So early on, when I first started in this role about a year ago, that was, I couldn't even conceptualize that. My hope and desire was that I was just going to come in and fix people. And my goal was targeting every single young mother. That was really what I was looking for. And so I say process a lot, but that has been the key. One of the major keys of my sobriety it was learning that I needed to take care of myself first if I was going to be effective to anyone else. Right. And also separating myself from individuals, right, and their experiences. When I first started, I met a young girl who reminded me so much of myself. Her story did, and I would, even after work hours, in my mind, I would take home all of the activities of that day, the interactions I had with her. I would, ruminate on all these ways that I could fix it or potentially save her, and almost taking on her journey and her experience in a way that I don't have power and control over. I just simply don't. And again, that took time to really understand that, hey, I'm going to get burnt out here if I keep trying to play God, if I keep trying to come in and save these people, because A, I can't, and B, it's actually more harmful than helpful. So I would say where I'm at today, I certainly get that sort of depleted exhaustion feeling, especially by the end of the week. But I don't somehow just naturally or organically taking on the problems of others has sort of dissipated. I think I realized the lane I really need to stay in order to be effective.
And I think that is an outward, it's obvious outward that you're doing that, because one of the things that you do well that I've seen as well is around barriers, in terms of how you establish your barriers. It's one of the challenges I think a lot of us struggle with, is that we do have good intentions entering into these roles. The whole point of getting into this work is to help people. We're not just kind of going, I would think, well, first of all, anybody listening to this show that goes into peer work to get rich, you're nuts.
That is true.
That's an unrealistic expectation.
That is true.
Yeah. What is a realistic expectation is that you will you will help people make their next best choice. It will happen. There will be few that you will, some you won't, some will tell you they are and they're not. But there always, it seems like in almost every client that I've been around, there has to be a healthy barrier set up. Because once they start to understand that you have what they want it. And they're obsessed for it.
Absolutely. And I think that brings in the whole role modeling. So I always try to keep in mind with each individual that I encounter that their recovery is their recovery, and that it's intended to be self-directed and person-centered. So as far as I may see some similarities, and generally I see lots of them in terms of behavior or just what they've been through in general, that's where I can offer my lived experience and share, and that's also knowing how much of that self-disclosure to share to create that boundary and that barrier, but to say, hey, I'm right here with you, and I can identify, and then for them to kind of, using a lot of reflections, a lot of patience, for them to really dig deep into themselves to understand what would be best for them. One of the major, and this is a turning point in my personal recovery, one of the major events was that my daughter's father passed away of an overdose in 2017. So I don't bring that up often. And it is a very personal thing, and I'm being very vulnerable to honestly be able to even talk about it.
And I do appreciate that. I was surprised you actually brought that up.
I am surprised I did too, to be honest with you. It's a huge component of my recovery and my prior life, so to speak. However, I don't talk about it very often. I mean, I go to therapy regarding it all, those deep wounds, so to speak. But I think it's really important for folks to see me as human and not perfect. Right. I'm human, and I suffer from the same struggles that others do as well. So navigating that today in terms of my daughter, who's now almost 8, has lost one of her parents to this opioid epidemic. And that has been a journey. And I know I've shared with you just, even the last week, that it's been tough. She's been asking more questions, crying at nighttime. I think feeling that fear and confusion. So
when we look at that one, and first of all, I thank you for being vulnerable, bringing that up, because I am kind of surprised. That's a tough one for you, and I think it's an important message for our audience, though. He looks at statistically. Unfortunately, you're not going to be an anomaly for the kids going into kindergarten next year. Those kids going to kindergarten next year, I forget what the stat is, but it's honestly just a staggering number of kids going in, just incarceration alone from a drug abuse. But then you start talking about loss of life. It's substantial.
Absolutely.
And, I think that one of the lessons that I know this is a struggle for you. And, one of the pieces around this, and it's nowhere near this, but there's always this idea of no closure. And so if we've got this group of children coming in, we've already see suicide rates going through the roof, and you see drug addiction going through the roof with parents and stuff like that. Some people get better, like you. They find a way to move on and make themselves better, but how do they healthy deal with things that really don't have any closure? And I feel like in your life, at least I know that in the quietness of your head, you'll be sitting there going, that's not true, I haven't dealt with it, but you are dealing with it. And what I think is important about your story and the example that you actually do leave to people behind is that you can move forward, you can have an impact, and still deal with some very serious stuff in your life. It's not a cut and dry process we go through here. We don't magically get the sober wand and then all of a sudden go out and start helping everybody under the sun. We're in a process.
Absolutely, and that brings up my head, as you were speaking, my head was going all different directions because it brings up so many pointers and ideas that I want to share.
Good.
One of the biggest things that stands out for me in this grieving process is forgiveness. And I never, ever knew what forgiveness looked like, tasted like. I didn't know it. I was filled with a lot of self-hatred and hatred for the outside world in general. And I knew the idea of, forgiveness is for the other, is for you, not the other person. But I couldn't understand it. But I think the biggest piece, and it's a gift, honestly, is that I forgive him. I forgive because there were a lot of things prior, in terms of our relationship, while using. So I forgive him. I forgive the circumstances. Do I like them? Absolutely not. Am I trying to heal and grieve some things from my past simultaneously with my daughter? Yes. And that has proven to be quite the beast. But I have some peace around it all. I don't quite know how to word it, or some solace in knowing that A, he's not struggling anymore. And B, it was a huge reason that I am where I am today.
Right. There's a lot of people, I can tell you, that are thankful that you're where you are today. I don't wish that on anybody. Certainly. I think one of the things that is important, though, is it's above and beyond the forgiveness piece, is a reasonable expectation that just because you forgive and just because you've come to some sort of reconciliation, that's life as it is, not as you'd have it been. That acceptance part is one thing, but then recognizing what to do with that next stage is, I think, a lot of times where we get baffled. And you and I have had a very specific conversation about, you settle one fire, one stage in your life gets settled, either a court proceeding or whatever else gets settled. And then you're kind of like, well, that's what I need to do to get to the next stage. And all of a sudden you're confused, not knowing what to do next. And I feel like for us, that's growth. That we get to these new stages, we do have an understanding, we accept kind of what's happened, but yet that we feel lost because, now what? We're in this room full of uncertainty. And yet we feel like maybe we're doing something wrong because we don't know what the next stage is. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, that's where my recovery toolbox, if you want to say, comes in handy. And I personally utilize a sponsor who I tell her all the time that she saved me, and she likes to remind me that I did the left, right, footwork to get where I'm at, and also I rely on a higher power. Those things are very critical for that's my recovery program. That's what it looks like. That's my self-care. When I get in those moments of grief, which some days are a lot heavier than others, they really are. It feels like you're drowning, or it feels like I'm drowning, and I have no clear answers. I can't put into words what I'm even feeling or thinking. So I oftentimes will find myself not reaching out and not getting what we talked about earlier, that honest piece.
Right.
And that's when I really stay stuck. So it's been very important to me to have that network of trusted individuals to reach out to, even if it's just to say, hey, I'm having a really bad day and I don't quite know what to do here.
Yeah, I think that's the key part of it. So you talk about multiple paths of recovery. It's not wandering around a field. It's actually going on a specific path. You spoke about having a sponsor. I have a sponsor as well. I haven't relied on the sponsor the same way. So some people have sponsors and they change them multiple times. I think the real point is that you continue to move forward, and you cannot do it alone. Zero possibility.
Exactly. And I learned that the hard way for quite a few years, understanding that we part of the program, just thinking, and I don't know if it's the ism, if it's the disease or what it is that tells me that I can handle this on my own. It likes to isolate me. It likes to have me sit and stew in those uncomfortable feelings. But to also understand that even in sobriety and recovery, that those really icky feelings, they're not as jagged as they were, but they're still there, especially in the grieving process. And a lot of times, it's just facing them. It's facing everything.
Right.
And I guess facing that fear, identifying it for what it is. And I have noticed as well that every time I go through this rough patch, I face it and I stay on the path and I utilize the resources that are out there for me, I always get to the other side feeling rejuvenated. There's some kind of underlying growth, but it's not even a like, okay, I learned this and in like a data analysis or anything like that. It's this spiritual growth that just seems to expand, and I feel lighter. But there again, I'm not going to sugarcoat it that those hard times and compound that with the stressors of work or being a mom or whatever it may be, they show up again and they're there. But I know how to face them this time is kind of the difference. And
what you just hit on is something I've talked on the show a lot about, is hope doesn't always feel good.
Absolutely not.
Hope is just never looking over your shoulder again.
Yeah, and I don't think that's one of the promises, right?
No, it's not
always going to be.
But it is a false expectation when people go into it. I know that you probably face this. I certainly have faced this in an emergency room setting with family sitting there, and their expectation is that I'm going to fix their loved one. No, it's a journey, and it just started because they just stopped. We're at 0 right now. You know what I mean? They've stopped this time. Are they going to stop again when they relapse? Who knows? I mean, the point is that we can show them that when those days feel like crap, we don't use. It's not we just had a few drinks, we just did this. We just don't.
We just don't. And we keep showing up, right? Like sometimes that's the biggest part of my job, is that I might be tired or just worn out, not feeling like, putting myself out there for the day. Right. But I show up. I think that act in itself speaks volumes. I think that's a really, really important part, is the showing up piece.
That's interesting, and I would like you to touch on that and how you do that, because I know that's a challenge for you. That not showing up like you're an unreliable person, but you've had some pretty heavy stuff, and I know you're sharing some things, but I don't want you to share anything more if it's uncomfortable. But for the audience, I want you to understand, this is not a feel-good situation that Caitlin goes through on a day-to-day basis. She's got some serious struggles that she faces, and she does it correctly, in my opinion. I don't know if there is a correct way, but I see somebody bravely going and impacting people's lives. And this piece about being reclusive and showing up for work, we all too often associate that with a good or bad work ethic. In your situation, it's actually something that you had to address when your defense mechanism for something that hurts is to regenerate yourself. And now you've not only not get the opportunity to regenerate yourself, you've got to go help somebody else deal with the exact same things that you're probably dealing with inside of you. And I'm curious, what types of things that you do that could help somebody else, because you can't be the only one that struggles with that.
So I think that all comes down to balance. I think that there's times where it's really important to me to get outside of myself and to be there to help someone else. I think that's literally what I need a lot of the time. And then I think that knowing myself well enough and knowing when I'm starting to feel that spiritual distress, knowing that that's the time I need to start tapping into my personal toolbox and resources of recovery. So really understanding that balance. And, I'll put this out there too. I just started going to mental health therapy, and that was a big step for me, because for a long time I was very resistant to any help in that way. Even though I, on a daily basis, am, all for it and whatever that journey looks like for you, absolutely. But I think just due to personal reasons and in my childhood, I was afraid. Let's put it simply. I was very, very afraid to tap into not so much the most recent traumas that have happened or events that have happened during sobriety, but all of that stuff early on. Right. And to put not a label, but more of a name to it, to identify that, because I guess my biggest thing is I never want to be a victim of my life. That's a big, big thing for me.
It's pretty powerful.
I played the victim role pretty darn good during active use, right? Because that was a tool that I utilized pretty darn well. But I'm very mindful to not carry over that victim role during sobriety. However, the catch to that is that I have learned in some situations from my past, I truly was the victim. Right. And I needed to understand that separation.
The difference.
And that role in a part that I had a part in or I didn't.
I would suspect that's not uncommon. And I'm not trying to make this a male-female thing, but given the situation that you're in was very common. For the drug use especially, it is hard to differentiate this place where you got to take ownership and where you actually were a victim. I would imagine that I don't know how you do it without professional help. So I don't know that's how it's possible, because there is a split. We do have to own our recovery. We have to. But there's also these outside, the things that we can't control, we're supposed to let go of. Doesn't mean they just sit in a pile and don't chew at you. And in those types of situations where you actually were victimized, they have to be addressed. And I think that that's important for people to understand. It's okay. Do it.
You're absolutely right. And I think I definitely had a tendency to take on things that were not mine to own.
Right.
Yet didn't own the things that I played a very active part in. So weeding that out, distinguishing those things, and that helped with doing, for me, step work with a sponsor. But it's also this daily inventory stuff. And sometimes that alone, just keeping myself sort of sane and right-sized, so to speak, that's exhausting unto itself.
Right.
So there again, that's when I know I need to. I love meditation. I'm a big proponent of
Not
meditation, prayer. When I first discovered meditation, I was like, oh my gosh, where has this been my whole life? You know.
You talk about prayer. My biggest gift with prayer is finding out that I could talk to God all day long and I didn't have to sit still to do it.
Absolutely.
We'd probably have a very poor communication if I had to sit down to pray to God. But yeah, so you're with that split. One of the things that you do by announcing that and declaring that you're going through that treatment process is you're making it okay. And I think a lot of what we try to do when we are on these larger platforms, when we are out here, you know, you talk about the radio partners and people that we see in the community that do this too. We're making it okay. And in some cases, I think sacrificing our vulnerabilities and I know a lot of things I confessed to on the show have been difficult. And I know some of the things that you're sharing here are difficult. The other side of that, though, is we've got to maintain our tolerance when people come to us over things that we've already moved past. I don't know about you, but I get extremely aggravated seeing people do exactly what I did. Like, I wanted grace then, but when I see them doing it, it's just like, come on. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I wonder how do you deal with that?
You know, it's interesting because I just had a situation like that last week. And I was actually shocked with myself. I had this piece about it while I was interacting with the individual just because it was literally like a movie reel of my entire life. And just, you know, the way this individual was speaking, different tactics that were being used, I could just relate so much that I knew where my part was and what kind of help I could offer her and very simply what I couldn't. And so I could kind of gauge where she was at because I have literally been there. And that's not to say by any means that I always do that or have that kind of tact about things because, again, when I'm feeling like I'm not spiritually, mentally, physically fit, whatever that may be, and that we talk about with Connections Grounded Recovery, especially, is the holistic approach, right? So the purpose of it is mind, body, and soul. And so when that's not lined up in my life, I really have a hard time not just being there for someone else, but distinguishing that separation and those barriers there.
Understood.
Sometimes I would just want to swoop in with a cape and just solve everything, fix everything. But I have learned the hard way that that's just not possible. And that's when, too, my sponsor can kind of throw some humility at me.
Right. And I think that when we confidence, we'd have to be careful about the balance of that, too. Now, is this situation you're talking about the one I'm familiar with?
Yes.
Okay. So in that situation, fortunately or unfortunately, I was witnessed a part of it. I think that was a perfect example of the ownership piece that we talk about. Because in that case, somebody was in chaos. They knew that they were the core of it. They were the epicenter. There was nobody really a resource to put any blame on. So they had to go find somebody to blame so they could do exactly what they were going to do when they set out. And I think that we have all done that. I know for a fact I did that.
Exactly. So in my mind, I'm thinking if I need to be the quote unquote bad guy in this situation in order for any kind of referral or resource to be administered, that's something that I can take. I will take that on.
That lightning rod sometimes sucks the energy out of it. Yep.
I'll do that because I understand where
I thought you handled that situation quite well, actually. But, you know, as we're getting ready to wrap up the show here towards the end, we always try to get upstream, you know, and say, okay, you know, you and I, Caitlin, have gone down a pretty crazy road. You know, we've experienced things in our unique path and our unique journey. My history is not the same as yours. I mean, and some of the things that you deal with are definitely more difficult than I have to deal with. How would this version of Caitlin go back in time and help the old version? And, you know, not to make it too personal, but, you know, even your daughter, you know, I mean, she's heading into those years that start forming some decision making.
That's a really great question. So, it's interesting. I look back on my journey, and I don't know how I'm here. I thank God every day that I am. It's a gift. Just to be alive and waking up sober. So for me, I wouldn't change too much of my journey. I feel a sense of sorrow for that Caitlin who went through the things that she did and didn't have the self-worth or the self-compassion, or just wasn't ready to seek any kind of help. I feel very sad for her, but at the same time, I don't know as I would change much of my journey, because it's such a gift, and I'm able now to hopefully relay that in the most professional way possible to someone else. As far as my daughter, that's a little bit of a different story, because I want to guard her from the world. I want to shield her. I don't want her to go through any pain. However, I think the biggest thing that I can say to that is that I intend to always have open communication with her. I intend to be honest.
Right.
I live my life that way. That's a guiding principle of who I am. So I think it's very important. I think it's important for youth in general to know what's going on.
Truth is key. You said be honest. I mean, kids can cut through nonsense better than anybody. They know technology. They know bull crap.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I want to thank you again for having me, because this is what you're doing here is essential. It's very, very powerful.
Appreciate that.
And, thank you for allowing me to use my voice. It's very powerful. Thank you.
No problem. And we really appreciate you coming on here. I'm sorry that Brian wasn't able to make it here today. I was pretty excited to have your story and have you here. I know I personally was, having been your friend and knowing, your journey. You are an inspiration. You're not only an inspiration to women and mothers, you are to men and our community. There's people that come to you looking for their ground is slipping. They don't have a hand to hold, and you're helping them make their next best decision. And I see it firsthand. So the audience is just going to have to trust me on it. You're really good at what you do, and you are having an impact in our community.
Well, as are you, Chris. So thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in 100 Proof Living, where we believe that change lives change lives.